So this is some work we did going with what Peter was talking about, this idea of trying to quantify and get some numbers. This is a paper we published quite a long time ago. And this is the Clegg-Hammer surface hardness type data. And one of the things that was important to us from the eventing perspective, unlike racing, is that there's a lot of different types of motion. There's almost a stop as you approach a rather sizable obstacle and then ask the horse to make the effort to go over it. And then there's a landing. So you see here in the column, we looked at the hardness at takeoff and landing compared to an area where we just went away, where there had never been jumping efforts that we called the background. And then we did it as a function of jumping class. So beginner, novice, up to intermediate type things. And I've got some statistics in here, but typically what we tended to find is no difference in surface hardness from takeoff versus landing. They were always significantly a harder surface as compared to the background. We did not see increases in surface hardness as the jumping effort from, say, like a 2'7" to 2'9" effort at beginner novice went up into preliminary and introductory jumping efforts. The problem with this data, as other people have said, is that when you look at these Gmax numbers, I have no sense of scale. I cannot tell you at what level a Gmax would start to create an underlying injury to the horse. And it's not just in equestrian turf. We're still very much working this out for NFL and things like that. Dr. Andy McNitt at Penn State and Dr. John Sorokin at UT are leading experts in this area and are starting to get to the point where you could say, well, if you have a Gmax, then we can start to talk about some possible health injuries to an athlete. Unfortunately, these numbers are very much a covariate with underlying soil moisture. So table 3 is where we try to do sort of a homemade type penetrometer that was a complete fail. Figure 1, here is an example using a RIMIC soil penetrometer. It's a little more accurate than some of the ones that Peter showed and discussed. But again, you see across the top there where it says soil resistance and megapascals. I can't give you numbers at which I can start to talk about a catastrophic injury. And again, these numbers are highly variable with underlying soil moisture. I can tell you from years and years of research in cotton dating back to the 1940s, somewhere around 2.5 is where we start to see roots that won't make it through the soil. So what does that mean about the underlying stability of turf? And again, it's going to be highly variable with turf type and soil type. So this is the sort of stuff that I enjoy, that we're still trying to figure out, as others have said before me, how do we quantify that data?
Hello there, so my name's Alison Northrop. I'm a senior lecturer at Nottingham, Trent University in the UK. I'd like to start off by thanking Mick and his colleagues for some excellent talks over the last few weeks. I've really enjoyed them. And I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to talk today, so thank you very much. I'm talking to you about a different type of equestrian sports surface, so I'm going to be talking to you about cross-country ground and actually the way that we've started to measure cross-country ground and identify ground condition in the UK. So I'm hoping that there'll be information that we can extrapolate from yourselves and actually vice versa. So hopefully it'll be a bit of interesting information for you. I'm really talking to you about a project that we've been running now for a couple of years, and actually this is a collaborative project, so you can probably see at the top of this slide there's a number of different institutions that have been involved in this work, and I will actually acknowledge all the individuals that are absolutely integral to the success of this project. It's still ongoing, so it's still quite early days, but on the final slide I will acknowledge the rest of the team. So just by way of a quick introduction, I guess, to thinking about cross-country courses and thinking about actually what the rider and the horse experience as they go around these types of tracks. At the top end of the competition, so at advanced level, you're looking at actually a course of around about 3.5 to 4 miles. The horses are going to be galloping at approximately 9.5 metres per second, which is around about 22 miles per hour. You can compare that directly to thoroughbred racing. Of course, it's dependent upon length of race and class of race, but we're looking at around about 16 to 17 metres per second, and therefore around about 35 to 38 miles per hour. So there is a little bit of difference in terms of the demands of the horse, but indeed these horses are working in gallop and encountering, for instance, in cross country, encountering solid obstacles that they need to navigate their way through as they go around the course. In cross country, you have an optimum time which the rider and the horse has to get as close to as possible, and so for these courses that are around about 3.5 to 4 miles, we're looking at around about 11 minutes. But of course that's totally dependent on the terrain, the type of course, etc, etc. So that just gives you a little bit of background, I guess. In terms of thinking about the surfaces, I'd often describe these surfaces as amenity grassland, which is essentially they're used for a variety of different activities. So that might be things like walking dogs, having picnics, training, so training courses for cross country. It might be grazing land, and it might be old estate land. So invariably these courses actually are being utilised in a variety of ways throughout the year, but there would probably only be a handful of competitions at each one. So some might have 1 or 2 competitions, and some might have more, again dependent upon maintenance and kind of the situation of that particular event. We also have horses actually running all day, so the first horse might start early in the morning, but actually that competition might run through till after lunchtime, so there'll be a number of horses that are running on this course, and obviously it's the horses' hooves are going to shear the top layer of the surface, and so actually it changes throughout the day. The way that we're measuring it at the moment is when it's prior to the competition starting, so we're looking at trying to either measure first thing in the morning, and possibly we'll measure the day before, and on occasion it might be that we measure twice prior to the competition starting. But as you can see as well in this little image on the right hand side, quite often you might have roads that are bisecting the track. We're not particularly interested in measuring these at this stage. We're actually just trying to get a much better handle on actually the surface and the going around the course, where the horses are galloping in between fences and in between these kind of tracks or roads that might bisect the course. I guess, and again this is what this whole session is all about, but the idea that actually if we can measure the surface and we're confident in the way that we're measuring the surface, actually then we can manage it to a certain degree. Of course that's totally dependent on resources, personnel, etc, and actually for a lot of these events it's quite restrictive in terms of the number of or the amount of resources that are available to be able to manage the course. You're never going to be able to measure it with intricate in intricate detail. A lot of these courses you won't have any roads or anywhere to be able to move between one fence and the next, unless of course you're walking, which you can see in this example here in the image on the right hand side. As I've already mentioned, the main aims of this project is actually to develop a suite of tests to allow us to reliably measure track functional properties, and the way that we're doing this is actually looking at a number of relatively simple pieces of equipment and then measuring them, so comparing them directly to what we describe as the gold standard, which is the Arona biomechanical surface test to the OBST, that actually allows us to confidently measure functional properties of the surface, which actually my colleague Dr. Sarah Jane Hobbs has already talked to you about previously within this session. Just as a reminder then, the functional properties that Sarah talked to you about was impact firmness, grip, cushioning, responsiveness and uniformity, and with the OBST we're able to measure these, and as I say, the idea is to be able to identify a number of simpler pieces of equipment that are actually much more manageable in terms of being able to get around a cross-country course and take some assessments, measure it and move on prior to the competition actually starting. Of course, I mean, I've put the question here, what is acceptable footing? So what's acceptable for cross-country courses? And because we haven't really measured it at this stage, there's up until this project starting, there were no objective measurements of the surface, and therefore, of course, we hadn't got any kind of idea as to what we would expect. And so this project is providing us with quite a nice survey of understanding the variety of functional properties that we're going to find on these cross-country courses, and that will help us to identify what is an acceptable range or what's acceptable footing for cross-country events. So there's a number of test devices that we've been looking at, and of course I've already mentioned just now that we've got this criteria for test devices, and probably one of the most important ones is that actually that the equipment that we're going to use are manageable, and they're something that actually you can use over 3.5 to 4 miles of track on foot. So that's a really important one. They need to be relatively quick to use, because again, if we're testing prior to, or if the groundsman or course managers are testing prior to the event, it needs to be relatively quick and also relatively low cost. So some of you might be familiar with some of these pieces of equipment, and I'm just going to give you a very brief overview, because I'd like to just spend a little bit of time talking actually about the results that we got. But the Clegg Impact Hammer, which is the piece of equipment that you can see on the left, which I think some of you may well have used before, it can be, it's a reliable measure of looking at compaction or hardness of the surface. So the very top layer of the surface, essentially you've got this weight that drops, and you can measure the deceleration of this 2.25 kilogram weight that drops 0.45 meters and down the tube, this yellow tube, if you can see this image on the left. And it's quite a useful tool for things like, for instance, quality control, or maybe if you're installing perhaps an arena and actually looking at high resolution sampling just to assess what's going on. But certainly it's not going to be indicative of actually what the horse is experiencing. And when we're thinking about tracks, when we're thinking about any kind of turf track, of course the measurements that we're taking, or our understanding of the surface, is complicated by their stress-strain behaviour, and obviously dependent upon loading rate and also magnitude of load. And so using something that's like the Clegg Impact Hammer, we've actually ruled that out right from the start. So we're not using that as a piece of equipment that we're interested in perhaps taking forward in our suite of tests. The other measurements, the other pieces of equipment that you can see here, all of these will actually be being taken forward for our tests. We've got the going stick, which measures penetration and shear resistance. It's a tine that you insert into the ground and then pull back at a minimum angle of 45 degrees. So that's kind of giving you an indicator of shear resistance. If I get time nearer the end of the talk, I might talk a little bit more about some of the kind of I suppose challenges of some of these pieces of equipment, but actually certainly with the going stick there's still some areas that are worthy of investigating further. We've then got two penetrometers. So the image in the middle is the Lang penetrometer, which is a handheld penetrometer, and then we've got the Longchamp penetrometer in the next image on the right hand side, one in, and this is a dynamic penetrometer that some of you might be aware of. I know that Mick's got a much fancier instrumented penetrometer rather than our bog standard one that I've presented here. The last piece of kit that we've got here in this image, in this slide, is what's called the Vienna surface tester, and this was developed by colleagues from the Veterinary University in Vienna. So it's Professor Christian Paham and Dr. Peter Schrammel have actually designed this. It's a bowling ball that's instrumented, and it allows us to be able to measure stiffness or hardness of the surface. It measures displacement and also energy restitution. So again, this is another piece of equipment that we're very keen to see whether or not actually we can identify a relationship between what we measure with this and actually what we're measuring with the OBST. So all of these pieces of equipment, these other four pieces of equipment, have actually gone into the kind of suite of tests that we're using to see which ones are going to be most important in the future. So when we're looking at these courses, we're mapping them. We're systematically sampling every 250 metres. We're taking functional properties, and we're also at events that we have enough people or personnel to be able to do so. We're taking soil samples as well, and we're taking these around a depth of 200 mil, and this actually allows us to be able to then split it off to look at the moisture content of the very top layer, so that's the top 50 mil, and then actually look at the lower level of moisture content as well. So it allows us, and again we're using TDR, so time domain reflectometry, to be able to measure volumetric water content at these two different levels. And this is going to give us more information about what's going on underneath the surface, which I think is quite important. You can just see here at the bottom, so essentially we'll map the surface. We've got functional property data, soil samples from all of these different locations, and you can see from this map that actually there is a variety of different types of terrain, and actually a variety of different terrain that's managed in different ways, or is anticipated that it's managed in different ways. Certainly it's covering lots of different country, and often different types of soil texture within this one track. And of course then we can record all of this information and colour coordinate it, that actually provides some really kind of usable information that the groundsmen and the track managers can then take forward and use in terms of their preparation prior to the event. The soil sample, I'm just going to talk very briefly about this before I go on and just have a look at a couple of graphs that we've pulled up, or we've a little bit of analysis that we've done on the data so far. But obviously with soil analysis, and I know we've had some really nice information in the previous sessions about soil analysis and actually understanding a bit more about how important that is for nutrients, and actually being a growing medium for the turf on the top layer. But it is actually quite important as well for thinking about the mechanical properties of the surface and soil texture. In other words, the proportions of sand, silt and clay can determine or help us determine things like water carrying capacity, permeability, bulk density and aeration, porosity. A number of different characteristics of the soil can then kind of feed into a better understanding of those functional properties. At the moment we're looking at soil texture, and actually we've just started actually looking at laser diffraction to be able to identify the particle size difference, which of course once you've got a good methodology going, it's much quicker than some of the more traditional methods of assessing soil texture. But this allows us to map the soil type at event sites, and it's hoped that it's not going to predict performance or risk, but it will actually help us predict what's going on with the surface in relation to those tests and essentially the functional properties that we're identifying around the course. Obviously understanding a bit more about the soil is beneficial in terms of decisions on maintenance, etc. So I think that's something that's really important as well. I'm just going to move on, and for the last couple of minutes I just want to speak to you about these graphs, which actually give us a little bit of a better understanding as to what relationship we've found between some of these tests that we've done and the OBST readings, so those functional properties that you've heard about already from my colleague previously. So we found that there was a really strong relationship, or a relatively strong relationship should I say, between impact firmness and basically what we did was we produced a coefficient that was calculated by modelling a range of parameters. Essentially the model dropped any of the parameters that didn't seem to have any relationship within our data, and it allowed us to be able to identify which parameters might actually be the most important going forward. As I say, this is just preliminary data, so I'm only just touching on this fairly briefly, but what's quite nice is that then if we look at soil texture in relation to those the findings that we've got, or the model that we've produced, we're beginning to identify certain things that are going on. And of course, when we're thinking about impact firmness, it is all about that top layer of the surface, if you look at the little image up on the right hand side. And of course that has to do with things like the sward and the root structure within that root zone. And so it's not just to do with the soil texture, which is possibly one of the reasons why actually it's not necessarily clustered quite as clearly as it might be if soil texture was the only important element of what's going on here. So pretty similar really when we're thinking about grip. That's all about the top layer of the surface, but indeed again we've got a relatively moderate correlation here, fairly good correlation between the coefficient and then the grip. And again, what we're seeing is some of these, certainly some of the soil textures are showing a cluster within this data that we've got. I'm going to move on just in terms of thinking about time, but cushioning is quite an interesting one, and I think cushioning is all about the lower levels of the surface as well. And so actually when we're thinking about soil texture, that's pretty important. And you can see that we've got a cluster right at the top of the green diamonds and one at the bottom, and actually these relate as well to moisture content. So the level of moisture that was in the surface, the cluster that you've got down at the bottom is one venue that was a high sandy loam surface, and this one actually had relatively low moisture content, and the one that's much higher was a higher moisture content. I'll just finish with this slide here, which is responsiveness, and actually this is a weaker correlation and actually something that we probably need to keep working on. Of course, and again, soil texture, we've got lots of things going on. It's a little bit murky in relation to what's happening. But of course, we know that with responsiveness, there's actually a number of other parameters that are really quite important too. But what I wanted to do was just give you a little bit of a flavour as to some of the information that we've actually pulled out from this work looking at cross-country courses. Just before I finish, I would just like to thank the team. So I've included the key players within the group. Big shout out to Mark Lucy, who's actually done most of the data collection, almost single-handedly actually within the last year. So big thanks to Mark. If you have got any questions, then please do get in touch. I would be really pleased to hear from you. However, both Sarah Jane Hobbs and Lars Ropsdorf are actually within the session, so they may be able to answer some of your questions too. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.
This is Karen, and this is her land. She's been here a long time, along with Mojo. The first fence post went up here. Now there's 5,000 of them. After the storm, she started the cleanup here. And when she needs some peace and quiet, she always finds it right here. This is more than just land, it's home. Karen runs with us on a John Deere 3E Series tractor, because who says a day's work has to take all day? Nothing runs like a Deere. Search John Deere 3E Series for more.
Being a teenager and in high school and middle school is not easy for girls these days. And they get to come here, spend time working around the farm, spend time with the animals, and not feel that pressure until we go to horse shows. The first time I saw this land, I was about 12 years old. I came here with an old mentor. I fell in love with it as a little girl, and I said I was gonna own it one day. My mother, when I was 4 years old, put me on a little pony walking around the zoo. That was it for me. Love at first sight. Like any kid, when I was younger, I wanted to compete more in the Olympics and go Grand Prix and do things like that. But I put that all on the side and realized I had a different agenda in life. I've taught about 800 kids in this area. A typical day starts early in the morning with feeding the horses. Then usually we clean stalls. This is a daily chore, sometimes twice a day. I'm always on the tractor, mowing, spreading things around, you name it. This is a John Deere 3025E. I love my tractor. I couldn't live without it. I like to just relax and be left alone. I call it my husband. He's very reliable, and it doesn't argue. It's so easy to use. My 68-year-old mother has never driven anything like this before, and she was scared to death of it. And once she did, she loves it. She drives it all the time for me and helps me out around the farm. Being here in Florida, we deal with a lot of hurricanes, so it can be very stressful when we're in the path of one. That John Deere helps me so much. We go around picking up debris, moving, pushing things with the bucket. I always have an average of 50 students, so whenever there's a disaster that comes around, they're always here and they're ready to work. I call all my girls my kids. They're like part of my family, and they get scholarships for riding, and so we try to keep our sport here a little bit serious but fun. We go to the horse shows. It's great for them. Good, very nice. Teaches them a lot of sportsmanship, how to be more in charge and have more self-confidence. A little stronger on that. There. The parents tell me all the time, you are such a huge influence in our child's life. I love to share my experience with these girls and be able to steer them in a better path. Everybody always asks me, how do you keep doing this? I say, just the sheer passion of it. What am I gonna do? Get a condo on the beach somewhere? I'm happier here. I'm Karen Neese, and this is my land.